Hello, my name's Tegan. I'm wanting to do a book review today, and I haven't done a book review in a really long time, and I wasn't that good at them to begin with, so bear with me. But I finished a book last night, and I really liked it, like adored it, and it was Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, and I'm so sorry that it's backwards, but you can just look up the cover. I actually really like this cover. It's nice. It's a hunk of a book. It's like it's over 500 pages. It's about 550 pages, give or take. And the trouble with this book is that the more you love it, the more you don't want to tell anything about it because you feel like it'll ruin it for the next person to read it. And it says on the back, like, this is one of those novels that you envy people who haven't read it, and I certainly do because it was quite a trip. So I guess I will give you a little bit of a synopsis, but just, I feel like I'm lying to you because it's not what the book's actually about, it's just how the book gets going. Essentially, it's set in 19th century Victorian England, in 1862 London, and there's this 17-year-old girl called Sue Trinder, and she grew up amongst thieves and people who sell stolen goods for money, and the house that she lives in is a man comes there, a con man who they've worked with him before, called Gentleman, and he offers her a proposal to work with him in a con, to con this rich young girl into marrying him. So Sue Trinder is going to become her maid and aid in the wooing of said rich young girl. And there was this reviewer on Goodreads who said, this book is so not about, a man getting in a rich girl's panties. Like, it's just not. So yeah, that's all I'm going to tell you, and I really recommend you not read any reviews on this, because particularly on Goodreads, because I scrolled down and there was a spoiler in like line 1 of review 1. As far as I'm concerned, I consider it a spoiler. I had already read the book, thankfully, because I tend not to look at reviews until I read a book, but yeah, I would recommend just sort of trying to avoid as much information as possible about this book, because that will significantly increase your enjoyment of it. And one thing that significantly increased my enjoyment of it is things that I've read this year. There were a couple of things that I read earlier this year. The first being The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which I adored. And the second being a play called A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. Both of those I will link down below because they're in the public domain, which means they're free to read, so I will link them. And they're really great, and they really did enhance my enjoyment and my engagement in this book. It's sort of, for me, like, in my brain, I kind of think of them as like this unofficial trilogy. I don't know why, there's a connection there that both of those things were written in the 19th century and this is set in the 19th century, so they have similar themes as far as I'm concerned. And this book is so tricky to talk about that I'm actually just going to talk about a few of the themes that I felt came through in this book rather than the plot. The first thing that really shined through for me with this was the concept of identity. And I'm not really talking about identity in the, like, who am I, like, coming of age type story. I'm literally talking about, like, your ID, like, your name, who you present yourself as, like, what name you are using, and how that affects how you act and how you think about yourself. And, like I said, both Sue and the Gentleman, which is obviously not his real name, so, are both going to have to use fake names for to con this young woman. So, and that's just the beginning of that sort of thread throughout the whole book of your name and what that even really means. I mean, I'm making it sound a bit like an academic novel, and not that this book isn't unintelligent, it's just not an academic book, but these are just some of the things that stood out to me. And also how your mother, who your mother was and who you think of your mother as being, affects your identity now. So both of the main characters in this book are orphans, and so they don't know their mother. They never knew their mother, and they only really know who she was through other people telling them. And it's interesting to see how who their mother was affected how they were treated, how they were treated, how their mother's reputation affected their reputation, and how their mother's identity was completely wrapped up in their own identity and who they thought of themselves. Even being an orphan, sort of, you know, it was part of their identity. So, and it's not even really like a figure. It's just sort of a ghost of a mother. It's really, I found interesting. So, and the second main theme that I felt came through is the captivity and the objectification of Victorian women, and that's quite a sentence. And I mean by objectification, we often use that term nowadays in terms of women, and it's from a sexual point of view, like sexual objectification, but that's not even what I mean here. It's the objectification that happens isn't sexual here. It's literally like it's the opposite of personification. It's making this young girl into an object, and there's this particular character who identifies as objects, and the objects change depending on what location she's at throughout the novel. Like this one point where she feels like an old book, like a really thick, heavy old book, just to be, you know, dusted off and read and then put back on the shelf. You know, not used, never leave, you know, have no adventures, that type of stuff. And it makes more sense. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, but and then later on, in a different location, she feels like a second-hand object, you know, something to be sold for money, you know, a commodity, essentially. And, like, just that idea of her literally feeling like an object, and it changing depending on where she is. I really liked that. And then there's also the captivity of Victorian women, and that happens numerous times throughout the book in different ways and very interesting ways. The first is the young girl who she's sort of stuck in the mansion, you know, and she can't leave. She's not old enough to leave. And there was this passage in the book that I really loved, which it described the mansion as being like a doll's house, which connects it back to that play. But there was this passage where she was describing everyone runs on their tracks. Everyone, every day they run on their tracks, and sometimes they intertwine and then they leave and then they come back together. And if there's ever any variation in what people do every day, it just creates a slight divergent in the track, and it creates a new track. And she can practically look out the window and see the little like turning thing of the mansion, and just that image of, you know, this mansion being very tiny, like a doll's house, with a little crane of people like doing the same thing, you know, every day, you know, moving inside. I really love that image. I'm not doing it justice at all, but that image really stuck with me, and I probably will be using it in an essay that I have to write for A Doll's House, because we're studying it in literature at the moment. It was just a really nice image, or not a nice image, but good imagery, you know. But then there's also the captivity of women when they're crazy. It sort of, this connects it to the yellow wallpaper, where the yellow wallpaper is about a young woman, and her husband thinks she's hysteric. You know, she's being diagnosed with the hysteria that so many women were at, you know, the 19th century. And essentially the cure for hysteria was to lock them away, not let them do anything, and, you know, restrict all of their freedom. Like, I feel like how women were treated when they were quote-unquote crazy, which many of them weren't. They were just either, you know, depressed or, you know, showing any sign of emotion. Like, I feel like how women were treated when they were crazy represents how women were treated when they did anything, which was, you know, when they showed any sign of emotion, which was to lock them down, restrict, you know, limitations, 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 and it's just awful. Yeah, it's interesting how sort of in Victorian England craziness in women was perceived, and that's also why I think this book is so effective, is that it's set in Victorian England and it reads, I think, like a Victorian novel, not that I've read many, but because it's, you know, it was published in 2002, it has that objectivity that, you know, an actual Victorian novel can't have, so it's more explicit in some of the terrible stuff that went on in Victorian England that a Victorian novel wouldn't really have. It can take a stand back on the culture and the society then, but then it has these characters that, you know, are very much in it and very much a part of it, and I really enjoyed that. As much as I really love this novel, there was one bit that I kind of went, It was sort of the middle section. There was a middle, like, 100 pages where it really dragged, like, a lot, like, really badly. And the reason was because essentially those 100 pages were stuff we'd already read earlier in the novel, shown from a different perspective. And now that was really interesting. I mean, like, I was fascinated. I really wanted to know this new character or this new perspective, essentially, of something that I already thought I knew. But it went on too long. It essentially took up the same amount of pages as it did the first time, and it really didn't need to. Like, it could have, I'm not saying remove it at all, it was fantastic, but just, like, have it condensed, you know, move a little bit quicker, because there's not that, like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen. It's just hearing it from a different point of view. So I think it really could have been shortened, like, maybe even halved, you know, it would have been a much better thing like that. Move the story along a bit quicker. But, like, I mean, having said that, when I look back at, like, this book, I mean, it probably only went over a course of about a year, but it felt like it went over, like, decades. Like, it was, like, an emotional journey, and I know that sounds really wanky, but, like, if I think back to there were times and several times throughout this book, that my heart was beating because it was so tense and because I didn't know what was going to happen, and it was, oh my god, what if this and what if that, and then there were other times where I was really like, hey, like, I was really sort of squee fangirly because something good happened or whatever, and I had such an emotional response to this book, which is why I read, yet it's actually very hard for me to have such an emotional attachment to something, to a literary book. I have it all the time for TV shows and movies, but with books, not as easy for me. But I had it big time for this. It was so much fun being so emotionally attached to a book. And yeah, that's why I really wanted to talk about it. And one thing that really stands out for me with this book is how tightly woven the plot is. There's so many twists and turns in this thing that it often kind of feels a little bit messy, and then it all comes back together, and then it falls apart again, and then it's just the thing that I really admire with Sarah Waters' writing. This is the first book that I've read of hers, is that every single thing that happened in this book had to have happened for it to have had the ending that it did. Literally, there was nothing in here that I think was pointless or just put in for, it wasn't really necessary to the story or whatever. Everything was necessary, in the end, to have that ending, and that was really cool. Like, it was really fun to read a story that was so tightly woven, yet it goes in so many different places. It's, often books that sort of do that, they sort of get a bit too messy, like the Lost syndrome, where they just have too many threads and they can't pull it all back together. This did, and it did it really, really well. One thing that I really loved reading it was how much I could tell Sarah Waters loved reading it. I mean, loved writing it. Like, you could just tell she had a blast writing this, and that made me enjoy the reading process even more. I definitely want to read more Sarah Waters. I think I'll probably wait a little bit, because I think if I pick up any of her novels, no matter how good they are, I would just be disappointed that it's not more Fingersmith, honestly. So I think I'll wait at least a few months until I pick this up. It's also made me pick up Oliver Twist, because I'm now like really in the mood for 19th century literature, and I haven't read any Charles Dickens, so yeah, I'm reading Oliver Twist. I started it last night once I finished this, and I'm really enjoying it. It's not what I expected from Charles Dickens, but it's good. Yeah, it's a journey, at least an emotional one, and I can't recommend it enough. 5 out of 5 stars, as much as it dragged a bit in the middle. And that's one thing that I actually really liked. Like, when I look back on it, there's so much stuff that happens in this book that if it wasn't, 550 pages long, it could have been really, really condensed. Or like, not condensed, like, too packed, I'm not thinking of the right word, but it could have been really too much. It could have been turned into a thriller novel, where every chapter ends on a cliffhanger, and oh my god, it has to change the entire plot every 30 pages or whatever. It wasn't like that. It had portions of the book where it was actually quite slow, and I feel like during when I was reading it, I was kind of like, oh, this is a bit slow, huh? But looking back on it, it needed those sections to give the characters and even the story itself just room to breathe. And then it has those moments that are really, shocking and surprising, and all those turns in the story and stuff. And I feel like it actually had a fantastic balance between that, like, better than any book I think I've read. Fahrenheit 451 also, I feel like, had that balance between, having enough twists and turns to be engaging, but also real, and sort of giving the story room to breathe and not, compacting things too much. Yeah, I really, really liked it. That's my review. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, in case you didn't, couldn't tell. Oh, I literally just sat there after finishing it for like about 20-30 minutes, I'm not even kidding, and I just sat and thought about the book, and I haven't done that all year. It's most definitely my favourite novel that I've read this year, and it was good. It was good to read something that I loved again, and my voice is like going, so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.